Today I'm going to tell you a story so quiet, it hurts so heavy it stays with you long after the fire dies. Out on the high Apache plateau where the wind stops without warning and the land remembers every wrong step. It begins with a single pale track in pollen, small, deliberate, forbidden. One wrong touch, one broken silence, and everything the people had left begins to unravel. The high plateau of the Apache lands lay still under the pale dawn, the kind of quiet that comes after rain when the earth holds its breath. Lone elk moved low through the scrub moccasins, silent on wet stone bough, unstrung across his back. He had come this way many times in the 2 winters since wren and sparrow left the world, always skirting the low mound of rocks that marked where they rested, never closer than the length of 3 long paces. Names of the dead stay unspoken. Their places stay untouched. That was the way. This morning the wind died without warning. No rustle in the juniper, no call from the canyon wrens. The air thickened heavy with the smell of damp pinon and wet dust. Lone elk stopped. His right hand rested on the knife at his belt, not drawing it, just feeling the familiar weight of antler handle against palm. Ahead on the flat slab of sandstone that no foot should cross a single track, showed pale against the dark rock white pollen or ash, fresh enough that the edges had not yet blurred. He knew the mark. Not settler boot, not animal pad. Human deliberate placed where the burial stones met open sky. Someone had stepped there without the smoke of cedar to cleanse, without the proper distance. The violation sat in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Rings of consequence moved outward unseen but felt. Lone elk crouched. The track led north, faint, but straight toward the cluster of wickiups where the people wintered. Toward the fire smoke that rose thin and steady against the brightening sky. Toward Nora Kane. He had seen her yesterday at the edge of camp, sitting apart, hands folded too tightly in her lap. Silas Crow had stood over her longer than custom allowed voice, low pressing something small into her palm, something that glinted once in the firelight before she closed her fingers around it. Lone elk had turned away then. 2 winters of turning away had kept the ghost quiet. Now the quiet had broken. His breath came shallow, measured. The weight in his chest was not fear exactly, but the old knowledge that once a thing is touched wrongly, the land remembers. It remembers longer than men do. He could walk past the track, pretend the wind had scattered pollen in the night, keep the distance he had kept since the burial fires died. Or he could follow it, see where it ended, and carry the knowing back to the people. The sun cleared the rim rock. A single raven called once harsh and alone, then nothing. Lone elk rose. He stepped over the white mark without touching it, boots careful on the stone. The track continued faint but unbroken, pointing home. Behind him, the burial mound waited, unchanged. Ahead, the smoke rose thinner now, as though the fire itself felt the weight of what had been done. Lone elk walked toward it, slow, the knife still in his belt, the bow still unstrung. The land had noticed. It would not forget. The sun had climbed halfway before Lone elk reached the camp. The swoy lay empty now, a wide scar of cracked mud and scattered stones, the water that once ran here gone since the last moon. Smoke rose thin from the central fire, smelling of dry cedar and old hides. The people moved slow in the heat, women tending the few goats, men mending nets, yet the usual talk was absent. Children stood still, watching the ground, as though it might answer questions they had not learned to ask. Lone elk came in from the north rim, boots soft on the gravel. He saw Nora first. She sat apart from the fire, knees drawn up back to the low wall of brush that shielded the wickiups. Her hands rested in her lap, palms up. He crouched before her, close enough to smell the pollen on her skin, sharp like crushed sage mixed with ash. Her hands trembled once, then stilled. She opened them wider. The red dust clung in the lines of her palms, proof that could not be brushed away. Lone Elk's breath came even, but his throat tightened. He saw the small leather thong still knotted around her wrist, Silas's mark, the one he tied when he pressed the bundle into her hands the night before. Silas had spoken of strength of debts owed to the land and the whites who claimed it now. Nora had listened because she had no other place to stand. The dog barked again, sharper head turned toward the mound. A few heads lifted in the camp, then turned away. No one came closer. Lone Elk reached out slow and touched only the air above her hands. He did not take the pollen. He did not wipe it away. To touch would bind him deeper to the violation. To leave it would let the ghost walk farther. Nora's eyes met his. Her voice came low, rough, from dust and silence. I touched it because Silas said we had no choice. The whites want the spring. He said this would give us power to keep it. She closed her fingers. The red dust cracked along the creases. Lone Elk stayed crouched a long moment. The camp held its breath with him. Then he rose, turned his back to her, and walked toward the fire. Behind him the wind started again, low at first, then rising to a thin, steady whine through the junipers. It carried no words, but it carried memory. The ghost had heard. He did not look back. The fire in the center of the camp burned low that night, fed by dry juniper branches that snapped and spat thin sparks into the dark. The people sat in a loose circle, knees drawn up against the cooling earth faces half lit by the glow. Smoke hung heavy, smelling of resin and old sweat. No one spoke above the crackle. The elder, gray-haired, thin as winter grass, sat closest to the flames, his hands resting palms down on his thighs. He had not moved since sundown. Lone Elk stood outside the circle, back against a post of the wickiup farthest from the light. His arms hung loose at his sides, but his right hand rested near the knife-hilt thumb, tracing the worn antler without drawing it. He watched. He had watched since the pollen mark was found at the burial stones, the red dust now faint but still visible on the ground where Nora had sat earlier. The elder lifted one hand. The gesture carried no anger, only the slow weight of what had to be done. He spoke without raising his voice. Pollen was taken from the place that should not be touched. The spring runs less. The grass browns early. The land feels the wrong. Eyes shifted. Not to Nora, not yet. To Silas Crow, who sat nearest the elder's shoulders squared, as though the words were aimed elsewhere. Silas's face stayed hard, jaws set. He waited until the silence stretched long enough to demand answer. It was not me, Silas said. His voice came flat-measured. The girl did it. Nora. I told her the whites press close. They want the water. She took the pollen to call strength for the people, to keep what is ours. A murmur moved through the circle, low and brief, then gone. No one looked at Nora directly. She sat at the edge, knees pulled tight to her chest, hands hidden in the folds of her blanket. The red dust still clung to her fingertips. No one had offered water to wash it away. The elder turned his head toward her. Not accusation, only the long look of a man who has seen too many winters and too few springs. The land does not ask why. It only remembers. Lone Elk felt the shift in his chest again, sharper now. His fingers closed around the knife hilt, not pulling, just holding. He had been the one closest to the stones for 2 winters. He had walked the same path every dawn, never crossing the line. Now the people's eyes slid toward him, brief and sidelong. Suspicion not yet spoken. If he had known and said nothing, he carried part of the wrong. If he spoke now, he named the violation aloud, broke the silence that kept the dead at rest. Nora lifted her head. Her eyes found his across the fire. No plea in them, only the steady knowledge that the circle had already begun to close. The elder spoke again. If the wrong is not cleansed, the ghost walks closer. The water will not return. The people cannot stay on ground that turns against them. He paused. The fire popped once, sending a spark high. It died before it reached the stars. The one who touched must leave, alone, until the land forgets. Silas nodded once, as though the words settled something inside him. Nora did not move. Lone Elk's hand stayed on the knife. The elder's gaze passed over him, slow and deliberate, then away. The fire burned lower. The circle held its breath. Nora's eyes remained on Lone Elk. He did not speak. His fingers tightened until the antler bit into the skin of his palm. Somewhere beyond the camp, the wind moved again through the junipers, thin and cold. It carried no words, but it carried the scent of dust from the burial stones. The land had not finished remembering. Dawn came thin and pale over the dry swoy, the light sliding across cracked mud like water that would not stay. The banks were empty of life. No frogs, no minnows. Only the stink of drying algae and the faint rot of fish that had once been small and silver, now belly up and stiff in the shallows. The elder had called Nora out before the sun cleared the rimrock. She walked alone to the place where the water used to run, strongest blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, against the chill that should not have been there in summer. Lone Elk watched from the rise above the camp, half hidden by a stand of twisted juniper. He had not slept. His back rested against rough bark arms, folded across his chest, but his shoulders stayed rigid, muscles locked as though bracing for a blow that had not yet landed. Below, the elder waited by a small fire of cedar and sage. Smoke rose straight up, then bent sideways in the still air, wrong like the land itself refused to breathe it in. Nora knelt on the dry bank. The elder passed the bundle of burning herbs over her head, slow circles murmuring words too low to carry. She kept her eyes down, hands open on her thighs. The pollen stain on her palms had faded to a dull rust overnight, but it was still there. The elder did not touch her. No one did. From the thicket of mesquite, 50 paces off, Silas Crow watched. He crouched low-breathed, shallow, one hand clenched around the small bone necklace wrens, the one that had hung against her throat until the burial. The beads clicked once against each other, faint as dry leaves. Silas's face was set jaw tight. He had come to see the purification through to make sure it finished what he had started. Lone Elk's breath came even, but his pulse beat hard against the base of his throat. He could see the necklace from here, the small curve of bone, the thin leather thong. Every time he looked at it, the memory pressed Wren's fingers, lifting it to show Sparrow the boy's small hand reaching. Now it was in Silas's grip, proof of the wrong carried farther. Lone Elk's fingers curled into fists at his sides. He stayed still. To move now would name the violation aloud, pull the ghost closer to every wickiup, every child. The elder finished the smoke. He set the bundle down, let it smolder. Nora rose, slow blanket slipping from one shoulder. She did not look toward the rise. The elder spoke once quiet. The land will say if it is enough. He turned back toward camp without waiting for answer. Nora stayed where she was, alone on the bank. The water that should have run at her feet was gone. A single dead fish floated past, eye clouded white. Silas stepped from the mesquite. He moved deliberate boots soft on the cracked earth. When he reached Nora, he stopped, held out the necklace. The bone caught the light, once dull, and yellowed. "If you do not take it back," he said, voice low, "the water will not come. The people will leave this place. All of it." Nora looked at the necklace. Then she looked up the rise to where Lone Elk stood. Her eyes held no question, only the flat weight of what was coming. Lone Elk did not move. His right hand had found the knife hilt again. He gripped it until the antler pressed white lines into his palm. A thin thread of blood welled along the edge of his thumb and dripped to the dirt. Silas waited. The necklace hung from his fingers. Nora did not reach for it. The elder's fire had burned down to ash. Smoke drifted thin across the soy, carrying the scent of cedar and something older, sharper. The land listened. It had not yet answered. The people broke camp at first light, and the wickiups coming down in silence. Poles dragged across the dirt hides rolled tight, the goats bleating low as children led them on thin ropes. The soy lay behind them now, a dry gash in the earth that no longer gave. Lone Elk walked at the head of the line, the gray mule he led, carrying the last of the water skins and the elder's bundle of sacred herbs. His steps were steady measured, but his eyes scanned the ground ahead, reading the faint trails of antelope and deer that still crossed the high plain. Nora walked last. The elder had spoken the order without looking at her. She must trail the group far enough that the dust of the others did not touch her blanket close enough that the land could still see her as part of them for now. No one argued. No one looked back. The children kept their heads down, stepping wide around the place where her shadow fell. Lone Elk felt the change in his hands first. At the midday halt, he knelt beside the mule, checking the cinch, and then drew his knife and tested the edge against his thumb. The steel caught light, bright and cold. He ran the whetstone along the blade twice, slow, deliberate, the soft rasp of stone on metal, or the only sound in the quiet noon. Then the bow he strung it drew once to feel the pull, unstrung it again, checked the sinew backing for cracks. He did not hurry. He did not speak. But the motions carried a new weight, as though each pass of the stone prepared for something beyond than the hunt. The new ground lay open, a wide basin of buffalo grass, turning brown at the edges. They reached it as the sun dropped toward the western rim. Lone Elk stopped at the first rise, eyes narrowing. Iron-shod tracks cut the soft earth, settler boots heavy recent. Not many, but enough. They had come close, perhaps scouting, perhaps waiting. The people saw them too. No one said the word aloud, but shoulders tightened, children were pulled closer. The boy, Nora's nephew, small and quiet, stood at the edge of the group, watching his aunt from 20 paces away. He did not run to her. He did not speak. His eyes held the wide stillness of a child who has learned too soon that some things cannot be touched. Night fell hard. The new fire burned small, fed by what dry wood could be found. The circle formed tight around it, backs to the dark. Nora sat outside the light blanket pulled over her head, alone on the open ground. The wind moved low across the grass, carrying the faint iron scent of the settler tracks. Lone Elk sat with the others, but his gaze kept drifting to her. He watched the way the firelight caught the edge of her blanket, the way she did not move to feed the flames or take water. His hand rested on his knee, fingers flexing once and then still. He turned his head away, looked into the coals. The boy appeared then, shadow small against the night. He carried a strip of dried meat wrapped in a scrap of hide. He walked straight to Nora's steps, careful eyes down. He set the meat beside her without a word, then turned and ran back to the fire, slipping into the circle, as though he had never left it. Nora did not reach for the meat at once. She stared at it a long moment. Then her hand moved slow and covered it with the blanket. Lone Elk watched the boy disappear among the sleeping forms. No one spoke of what had happened. The fire hissed as a small stick collapsed into ash. Beyond the camp, the wind rose again, stirring dust along the settler tracks. The land lay open, no longer hiding anyone. The basin held the last of the day's heat when the settlers came. 4 of them on foot, no heavy guns, only sidearms, and the long-barreled rifles slung loose across their backs. They walked the rise above the new camp as though the ground already belonged to them, boots scuffing the dry grass into dust that hung in the still air. One carried a rolled paper, claim paper perhaps, or a deed written in the white man's ink. They stopped at the edge of the circle, close enough for their voices to carry over the low fire. The elder rose first. The people followed, forming a half-ring, faces toward the strangers, but not too close. Lone Elk stood near the center arms, at his sides, the knife still sheathed, but his right hand, open fingers loose. He had not spoken since the march began. The elder stepped forward 2 paces, stopped, waited. The lead settler, a tall man with a beard gone gray at the chin, unrolled the paper, partway held it out like a shield. His voice came flat, practiced. "We've seen the spring dry, the grass gone brown. You folks can't keep this land the way it is. We're offering fair money, enough to move south where the water still runs." He paused, eyes sliding past the elder to Nora. She sat at the far edge of the circle, blanket drawn tight, head lowered. The settler's mouth tightened. "That one there," he said, nodding toward her. "Word is she's the reason. Touched what shouldn't be touched. Land knows it. We heard from your own Silas Crow. He told us plain." A ripple passed through the people, not words, just the small shift of weight from one foot to the other. No one looked at Silas. No one looked at Nora. The elder's face stayed still, carved from the same dry earth. Lone Elk felt the ground shift under him, not in fact, but in the way the air pressed heavier against his ribs. His eyes moved from the settler to the elder, then to Nora. She had not lifted her head. The boy, her nephew, stood behind her, now small hands clenched in the blanket's edge, eyes wide but silent. The elder spoke, voice low, carrying only as far as it needed to. "The land decides who stays." The settler shrugged, once rolled the paper tighter. "Land's decided. You can take the money or wait for more of us to come. Up to you." He turned. The others followed. Their boots left fresh prints in the grass, iron heels cutting deep. The people watched them go until the figures dropped below the rise. Then the circle loosened, but no one sat again. The elder turned back to the fire. His eyes passed over Lone Elk's slow measuring. Not anger, recognition. The man who had walked closest to the burial stones, who had led the march, now carried the same shadow as the woman at the edge. Lone Elk stood unmoving. The fear that had lived in him since the pollen mark had hardened into something else. Acceptance, perhaps, or the first edge of it. His hand drifted to the knife hilt, fingers closing around it without drawing. He did not speak. The elder watched him a moment longer, then looked away. Night settled thick. The fire burned low. Nora remained outside the circle alone in the dark grass. The boy had not moved from her side. The elder spoke into the coal's voice, barely above the crackle. "Tomorrow the woman leaves. Alone. The land will not hold her." No one answered. Lone Elk stepped forward out of the circle into the open ground. His moccasins made no sound. He stopped halfway to Nora, knife still in its sheath hand, still on the hilt. He did not look at her. He looked at the rise where the settlers had stood, at the iron tracks that cut the earth like a scar. The fire hissed once. A small coal popped, rolled into the dirt, and died. The boy watched from Nora's shadow. His eyes did not leave Lone Elk's hand. The wind rose again low across the basin, stirring dust along the settler prints. It carried the faint smell of iron and distant smoke. The land waited. It would not wait long. Dawn broke cold over the basin, the light flat and hard, no warmth in it yet. The settlers had come closer in the night. Their silhouettes showed on the eastern rise, rifles glinting once when the first sun hit the barrels. Not charging, not yet, just waiting the way wolves wait when the herd is already weak. The camp stirred slow, no fires lit. No one spoke above the low murmur of wind through the dying grass. The elders stood at the center of the circle the people had formed without being told. Nora knelt before him on the bare earth blanket folded beside her hands, open on her thighs. She wore only the thin calico dress, no ornaments, no moccasins. Exile meant leaving with nothing that tied her to the people, no name spoken in farewell, no blessing carried forward. The elder held a small bundle of sage unlit. He did not look at her. His eyes moved over the faces around him, counting who remained, who would walk away from this place when it was done. Lone Elk stood in the open ground between the circle and Nora. He had walked there on his own, no one calling him. His blanket lay behind him where he had dropped it. In his right hand, he held the bone necklace wrens, the small vertebrae strung on twisted sinew, the one that had rested against her throat until the burial. The beads were yellowed, worn smooth by years of touch. He had kept it hidden in his pouch since the night of the fire. Now he held it in plain sight. The elder's gaze settled on him. No surprise in it, only the slow recognition of a choice already made. Lone Elk stepped forward. His moccasins made no sound on the dry earth. He stopped 3 paces from the sage bundle, raised the necklace in both hands, and dropped it onto the unlit pile. The beads clicked once against each other, then lay still. He drew his knife. The steel caught the pale light as he cut a thin line across his left palm, not deep, just enough to bring blood. He let 3 drops fall onto the sage, then sheathed the blade. He took the elder's fire stick, struck it once against flint, and touched the flame to the herbs. Smoke rose thin at first, then thicker, coiling upward in the still air. The scent of sage and blood mixed with the dust smell of the basin. The settlers on the rise shifted. One raised a rifle, lowered it again. They watched. The people watched. The boy, Nora's nephew, stood at the circle's edge, eyes wide, unblinking, taking in every motion without sound. Lone Elk stepped back. The necklace blackened in the flames. The beads cracked once sharp, like small bones breaking. Black smoke rose straight, heavy, carrying the scent of burning bone and sage into the sky. The elder watched it climb, then turned to Lone Elk. "You have chosen," he said, voice low, carrying only to the circle. "From this day, your name stays outside the fire." No one moved. Lone Elk did not answer. His palm bled slow drops, darkening the dirt. He turned toward Nora. She rose without help, blanket left on the ground. Her eyes met his steady, no plea, only the flat knowledge of what came next. He extended his right hand palm up. She placed hers in it. Her fingers were cold. He closed his around them, once brief, then released. The smoke thickened black against the pale sky. The settlers on the rise lowered their rifles. The elder stepped back into the circle. The people did not follow Nora. They did not follow Lone Elk. The boy watched from the edge, small hands clenched at his sides. He did not cry. He only remembered. The wind came up then, sudden and low, scattering ash from the fire across the dry grass. The black smoke twisted once, then drifted north away from the camp toward the open basin. The land had heard. It answered with silence. The night came down hard on the open basin, moonless, the stars cold and distant above the black sprawl of desert scrub. Lone Elk and Nora moved away from the camp, without torches' feet finding the faint game trail that cut south through the creosote. The ground gave off the day's stored heat, warm under their moccasins, but the air had turned sharp, carrying the dry, metallic scent of distant rain that would never fall here. They walked in silence, Nora, a half-step behind blanket pulled tight over her shoulders. Neither looked back. The wind rose first, a low moan through the low brush, then sharper, whipping sand against their legs. It carried no sound of voices, only the hollow rush of air moving over empty land. Lone Elk felt it change before he saw it, the way the grain stung his face, like fine shot the sudden cold that settled in his lungs. He stopped. Nora stopped with him. Ahead the darkness thickened into shape, not solid, but a shifting absence of light, taller than a man, thinner, moving against the wind instead of with it. No face, no hands, only the outline of a woman's form wrapped in shadow, and the faint suggestion of long hair, lifting in the gusts that should have torn it apart. Wren's ghost, not angry, not pleading, just there blocking the trail, the wind curling around it like smoke from a dying fire. Lone Elk's breath caught once shallow. He stepped in front of Nora without thought body between her and the shape. His right hand stayed open at his side. The knife remained sheathed. He did not speak the name. To speak it now would call it closer, bind it tighter. Instead, he stood still, palms forward, letting the wind scour his skin. Sand stung his eyes, filled his mouth with grit. He tasted blood from where he had bitten the inside of his cheek. The ghost drifted nearer. The wind tightened into a coil, whipping around them, pulling at Nora's blanket until it tore free and sailed into the dark. She did not reach for it. She stood behind him, hands loose, eyes fixed on the shape. No cry, no movement to run. From the north came the crack of a rifle sharp distant. The settlers had followed the sound of the wind or the faint glow of the campfire they had left behind. Another shot higher, the bullet passing overhead with a flat whine. They thought the noise meant weakness, an easy end to the ones who had already been cast out. Lone Elk did not flinch. He reached with his left hand, drew the knife, and cut a fresh line across the heel of the same palm. Blood welled dark in the moonlight. He let it drip to the ground between him and the ghost, 3 slow drops that soaked into the sand without sound. The wind faltered for a heartbeat. The shape paused, edges blurring as though listening. The settlers fired again. This time the bullet came lower, grazing Lone Elk's shoulder. Cloth tore, flesh parted. He staggered half a step, blood hot against the cold air, but he did not fall. The ghost held still. Then it drifted sideways, dissolving into the wind, leaving only the smell of sage ash and dust. Nora moved then. She caught his arm, fingers tight on the uninjured side, pulling him forward. He went with her steps, uneven blood trailing in dark spots on the ground. The rifle cracks faded behind them, the settlers too far to chase on foot in the dark. They walked on. The wound throbbed with each heartbeat, warm blood soaking the sleeve, dripping steady. Nora did not speak. Lone Elk did not ask her to stop. The trail stretched south into the black, unmarked open. The wind followed quieter now, but still there, watching, waiting for what came next. The small rock shelter sat low against the desert floor, a shallow hollow scooped from sandstone by centuries of wind. Dawn light slanted in through the narrow mouth, pale and thin, touching the walls in long stripes. The air inside smelled of dust and drying blood. Lone Elk lay on his back against the cool stone, shirt torn open at the shoulder. The wound was a ragged line across the muscle-flesh parted edges, already darkening. Blood had soaked the sleeve and pooled in the dirt beneath him. He breathed shallow, each draw pulling at the torn place. Nora knelt beside him. She had torn strips from the hem of her dress, ground the last of the yarrow and sage she carried into a paste with a flat stone. Her fingers worked steady, pressing the green mash into the cut, wrapping it tight with the cloth. No words, No tears. The paste smelled sharp medicinal, but the blood kept seeping through, slow and dark. She tied the knot with teeth clenched, then sat back on her heels. Her hands were stained green and red. She wiped them on her skirt once, then let them fall to her sides. Outside, the basin stretched empty. No sound of horses, no distant voices from the camp. The people had chosen. They would move on, follow the thin trails south, where water might still be found, carrying the memory of what had been done, but not the weight of it. The settlers had not come closer in the night, perhaps wary of the dark, perhaps satisfied with the shots fired, but the iron tracks remained faint lines, cutting the sand, waiting for daylight. Lone Elk's eyes stayed open, fixed on the low ceiling. He did not speak of the pain, did not ask for water. His left hand rested palm up on his chest, the cut from the purification still raw, crusted now with dried blood. He had given what he could to the ghost. It had not been enough. The wound on his shoulder throbbed in time with his pulse, a reminder that some debts could not be paid clean. Nora watched him a long moment. Then she reached into the small pouch at her belt, drew out the last twist of dried meat, the one the boy had left. She broke it in half, placed one piece in his hand. He took it without looking, chewed slow. She ate the other half, the same way, mechanical, tasting nothing. A small shadow appeared at the shelter's mouth. The boy, Nora's nephew, stood there, barefoot, blanket wrapped loose around his thin shoulders. He had followed in the dark alone, without word or permission. He did not step inside. He only looked. His eyes moved from Nora to Lone Elk, then to the blood-soaked cloth, and then back to their faces. No sound. No question. He carried the silence of someone who had seen too much and understood it would not be undone. Nora met his gaze. She did not call him closer. The boy reached into his blanket, drew out a single smooth stone flat. Dark, the kind carried from a riverbed far north, the kind elders sometimes placed in a grave to hold a name. He set it on the ground, just inside the shelter's mouth, careful not to cross the threshold. Then he turned and walked away, small figure dissolving into the pale light. Lone Elk watched the boy go. His breath came ragged once, then steadied. He looked at Nora. She looked back. Neither spoke. The stone lay there small and quiet, a token that meant something once, but carried no power now. He pushed himself up on his good arm. The wound pulled fresh blood welling through the bandage. He ignored it. Nora rose with him, steadying his elbow without asking. They stepped out into the open basin. The sun climbed higher, throwing their shadows long across the sand, two figures uneven moving south. Behind them, the shelter waited empty. The stone stayed where it had been placed. The wind stirred once, lifting a thin veil of dust across the tracks they left. The settlers would find the camp soon enough. The people would move on. The land would remember. Lone Elk and Nora walked into the heat side by side, no words between them. The shadows stretched farther, then began to shorten. The basin lay open ahead, unmarked, unforgiving. They kept walking. The sun hung low over the rim of the basin, bleeding red across the sand and rock. They had walked until the light began to fail, until the heat gave way to the thin chill that comes before true dark. Now they stood at the edge of a shallow drop-off, a dry arroyo below them like a scar in the earth. No water ran there. No grass grew. Only the wind moved low and steady, carrying the faint scent of creosote and distant alkali. Lone Elk gathered what dry wood he could find, small branches snapped from dead mesquite, brittle as bone. He built the fire small, careful the way one builds, when there is no promise of another. Nora helped without words, stacking the pieces, striking flint, until the first spark caught. The flames rose, slow pale at first, then steadier, casting their faces in shifting orange. Smoke rose thin, straight up into the windless air above the drop-off, then bent sideways and drifted north. Lone Elk sat cross-legged on the sand. His shoulder throbbed under the bandage, the wound hot and tight. He drew his knife, the steel dull in the firelight. He reached up with his good hand, gathered a lock of hair from the side of his head, long enough to reach his shoulder, and cut it clean. The strand fell dark against his palm. He held it a moment, fingers closing, once then opened his hand over the flames. The hair caught, curled, burned quick and bright, the smells sharp and acrid, mingling with the smoke of mesquite. He did not speak. No prayer. No name. No elder to witness. The fire took the offering without ceremony, without forgiveness. Nora watched from across the small blaze. She sat with knees drawn up, blanket draped loose around her shoulders. Her face carried no tears, no anger. Only the flat stillness of someone who has walked past the last place she could turn back. The flames burned low. The wood collapsed into coals, red hearts, glowing, then dimming. Lone Elk stared into them. Nora stared past them toward the north, where the camp had been. The wind came up again, cooler now, stirring sand along the arroyo's edge. It carried no sound of pursuit, no echo of voices. The settlers had not followed this far. The people had not come looking. The land lay empty behind them, already forgetting their names. Lone Elk's hand rested on the knife hilt again, thumb tracing the worn antler. He looked south into the dark beyond the firelight. Nora looked north into the same dark, but in the other direction. Neither moved closer to the other. Neither spoke. The fire hissed once, a small coal cracking open. Then it settled, coals pulsing, slow fading to gray ash. Far off on the rise, they had crossed hours before a small figure stood watching. The boy, Nora's nephew, had followed again, silent as shadow. He did not come nearer. He only stood, blanket-wrapped, tight eyes fixed on the two below. Then he turned, small steps, carrying him back toward the north, toward the camp that would move on without them. He carried no stone this time, only the weight of what he had seen. The fire died to embers. The wind moved over the basin, lifting fine dust in thin veils. Lone Elk and Nora sat in the growing dark shadows, long and separate. The arroyo below waited open and silent. They did not rise yet. They did not need to speak of tomorrow. The land would decide that for them. The embers glowed one last time, then went black. The wind carried the last faint scent of smoke south, then north, then nowhere at all. The basin held them in its quiet, unforgiving embrace. They remained Apache, not whole, not forgiven, but still here. The cost was everything else. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours. Thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal barra disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals narration and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.